Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the Morning Bible, Wet Hair Edition. We are finishing off the last part of Jesus' sort of trial, so to speak. I call it a trial because it doesn't really follow the normal conventions of a trial, but we're on to the last little bit of that today. And so you'll remember before we sort of had Jesus first brought before the council of all kind of the Jewish religious leaders, the high priests, the scribes, etc. And they found Jesus guilty of blasphemy, even though he wasn't really. And then they took him before Pilate, who's sort of the Roman guy in charge of the region, who happened to be around at the time to kind of stop any uprisings happening. And Pilate couldn't find Jesus guilty of anything. He asked Jesus if he was the king of the Jews. Jesus says, "I am who you say I am," kind of thing. And Pilate goes, "Well, that's not really evidence enough." And so Pilate says we should release Jesus. The priests aren't very happy with that, and so Pilate sends Jesus across to Herod instead. He says, "I'm not going to deal with this." So Jesus goes to Herod, who's kind of one of the big top dogs in the area, and Herod kind of comes to the same conclusion. He goes, "Well, I can't really find anything wrong with him." Herod still mocks him. He still has him beaten. He puts clothes on him, sort of regal clothes to make him look like a king, but it's kind of king of the Jews to mock Jesus. He's king of the people who the Romans kind of oppress and see as being worth very little. And so Herod hands Jesus back to Pilate, and Pilate goes, "Well, I still can't find him guilty of anything." But the chief priests, the scribes, they will go, "Well, you need to bring him in front of the people." And so that's what we're going to get today. Jesus being brought in front of the people. So I'll quickly read the last bit of yesterday's passage because it flows straight into it. This is from yesterday's passage. "Pilate then called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people, and said to them, 'You brought me this man as one who was misleading the people. And after examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him, neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us. Look, nothing deserving death has been done by him. I will therefore punish and release him.'" So that was yesterday's passage, and now we're on to today. It's chapter 23 from verse 18. It says, "But they all cried out together." So this is the crowd that are there. This is going to be, the crowd's going to include the high priests, the scribes, but then also a lot of ordinary people. And so some of these ordinary people are going to be people who the high priests have kind of drummed up against Jesus, kind of people who they've brought in saying, "Come here and support us." But then a lot of them are going to be Jesus' followers. A lot of them are going to be the people who stood around in the temple listening to Jesus teaching. The crowd cried out together, "Away with this man, and release to us Barabbas, the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection started in the city, and for murder." So there's a Jewish, I don't know if it's even a Jewish thing. There's a custom that at Passover, one prisoner is released. I don't know whether this is something that comes from the Old Testament or my Bible doesn't really say. It just calls it a custom. So they had a custom where you would release one prisoner on Passover. And so they're now, it's still Passover. And so Pilate is saying, "Well, all right, we've got some prisoners here. We've got this Jesus guy, who I can't find him guilty of anything. And we've got this Barabbas guy." And so Barabbas, it tells us that he is a man who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city and for murder. So Barabbas is there for some big charges. He's there for murder. He's there for sort of conspiracy. I think for theft as well. Barabbas is there for a lot of different things. He's a very guilty man. Versus Jesus, who Pilate's saying, "I can't find him guilty of anything." And so let's see what the crowd kind of decide. So Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus. But they kept shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I found no guilt deserving death. I will therefore punish him and release him." So Pilate addresses the crowd again, and it tells us explicitly Pilate wanted to release Jesus. It's sort of, Pilate's a tricky character really, because you can see there's a level of, he's genuinely wanting justice. He's genuinely wanting to do the right thing. But he's got this crowd in front of him who are just screaming at him that Jesus needs to be crucified. And he's not quite begging with the crowd, but he's asking them, and he's continually asking, and he's on Jesus' side, weirdly. He's a Roman official who's kind of on Jesus' side, saying, no, we're gonna, this isn't fair, this doesn't make sense. But the people keep pushing for it. And he tries to appease them. He says, I'll therefore punish and release him. He makes that offer again that he made before. He's saying, look, I'll have him beaten, I'll have him, maybe slightly tortured for a bit, and then I'll release him. Is that fair? People are saying, no, you need to crucify him. And so what is crucifixion? Well, crucifixion was the method of killing someone that was reserved for high treason against the Roman Empire. And that was kind of what it was specifically used for most of the times, if someone committed treason against the Roman Empire. Jesus hasn't committed treason against the Roman Empire, but he's still being punished as if he had. The only treason that Jesus might have committed would have been if he'd told people to not pay their taxes to Caesar. But he told people that they should pay their taxes to Caesar. So there's absolutely no grounds for why Jesus is being crucified like this, except for the crowd wanting it. And so let's keep reading. It says, but the crowd were urgent. They demanded with loud cries that Jesus should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate decided that their demand should be granted. He released the man who had been thrown into jail for insurrection and murder, for whom they asked, but he delivered Jesus over to their will. And so even though a minute ago I was saying, Pilate he's kind of defending Jesus. As a Roman, he's standing by Jesus and he's defending justice and all the rest of it. Pilate still crumbles. Pilate crumbles to the will of the crowd. And so sort of all that work that he'd been doing, trying to say that Jesus was innocent, trying to do that, in the end, it's all for nothing, because he gives in. It may be the people's will that this has happened, but it's still Pilate's jurisdiction, and Pilate's still the one who gives the order at the end of the day. And so the responsibility does still fall on him. So we've got this crowd who are urgent, demanding with loud cries that Jesus should be crucified. If you remember at the start of this video, I said the crowd it wasn't just the high priests and the scribes anymore. The crowd was the people from Jerusalem, right? And so some of these people, sure, they would have been against Jesus. They would have been drummed up by the high priests, by the religious officials. But a good chunk of this crowd would have been people who'd been following Jesus not long before. We had Jesus arrive in Jerusalem riding on a donkey, and we had a crowd sort of around him throwing down their cloaks onto the road to sort of welcome Jesus in. We've had Jesus teaching crowds in the temple. We've had all these interactions with crowds throughout the whole book of Luke that have been incredibly, incredibly positive. We know that there were crowds that followed Jesus around from city to city, right? There were these crowds who were, who'd see one miracle, who'd get one healing, and they'd stick with Jesus and they'd walk with him. Some of these crowds had women in them. There were some children, there were some families there. There were a lot of people following Jesus. And you can't imagine that these crowds get to Jerusalem, where it's all been building up to. Jesus gets arrested and then they go home. These crowds would have been coming over to where this is happening, and they would have been part of this crowd. They would have been part of this crowd yelling to crucify him. And so, a crowd is built up of individuals at the end of the day. So you can't speak for every single person in that crowd. But there would have been this mob mentality that sort of overtook them all. This kind of bloodthirstiness. Have you ever seen, when there's a crowd of people and they get something in their heads, that's kind of how riots break out. Sort of quite ordinary, good people can end up sort of burning cars and destroying shop fronts and things like that, just because they're stoked up by the crowd. And that's what we see here happening against Jesus, even with his own followers in there. And so Pilate releases Barabbas. Pilate's looking at this crowd and he's saying, well, the whole reason why I'm in Jerusalem is to stop an uprising, is to stop any kind of riot. And I can see one sort of building right here in front of me if I don't convict Jesus. And so Pilate cowers to that, and he crumbles, and he releases Barabbas, this guy who's known to have murdered people, and who's got all these huge charges against him, and he kills Jesus, someone who he can find absolutely no charge, no reason to kill him, no offence. It says he delivered Jesus over to their will. It is the will of the crowd, but Pilate delivers him. So that's where we're going to end it today. tomorrow we've got the crucifixion, which is a big old passage, so I'm going to do a bit more prep before I record that one. But I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you all then. Much love. Bye bye.